For the last year or so, my ministry partner and I have been trying to develop something called Bible Lab. It's where women gather around in a circle and learn together. Actively study together. What we hope is in really deep and meaningful ways. Well, finally, we had gotten to the night where we were going to crack open the Bible to 2 Timothy, and we were going to look at context. Who, where, when, what, how. I was so excited. This was going to be fantastic. And as we gathered that night and I started talking about context and what we were going to do, have you ever been either leading a small group or maybe even just talking to some of your friends and you can feel the room lose its energy and lose its interest? That's what was happening as I'm talking about context. And once we started doing it, it's like it was not very exciting. I started to hear things like, wait, why do we have to do this? And another friend saying, I hate this part. History is so boring. And I remember looking around my living room and thinking, what is happening? I was really sad and confused of why context wasn't exciting for everyone. Well, I had this summer to think about it and to come up with a new idea of how we could look at biblical context that maybe would be a little bit more exciting. So we just tried it this past Thursday night, a new way to do biblical context. And I'm gonna tell you what, it was fun. The first place that I realized I went wrong was starting with who, what, where, when, why. Those are really good questions when you start to study the Bible before you actually dig into the text. The problem is that works for a percentage of us. Those of us who really like to study, are a little bit more up in our heads, all of that stuff is exciting. But to many, that's not very exciting. So what I started to do this summer was to really think about context beyond the who, what, when, where, why. I started to think of what's underneath the who, what, where, when, why. Those are facts, but really what are we digging for? And I realized that I was missing something as I'm bringing this to a study group, that really what we're trying to understand in context is we're trying to understand the people, the place, what it felt like, who they were in the original ancient context. And it reminds me of the story. If you've been around, if you went through the Job Bible study, you heard the story, but just bear with me. This has been about a decade ago. I went to Walmart wearing what I should not have been wearing, which was like my pajamas. Basically what I wear to bed. I did not change out of what I wore to bed, and I just went to Walmart praying to the Lord, please help me not see anybody that I know. And of course, you know that I did. I'm walking toward the cheese section, and lo and behold, there is my pastor and his wife. Now, I did not know my pastor very well at all, but I did know his wife, Jana. And of course they saw me. Like, I would have totally just dodged them, but it's like we made eye contact, so there was no stopping it. So I walk up to them, greet both of them, and Jeremy, who is our pastor, I perceived him to be eager to go. So as I'm talking to Jana and Jeremy is slowly backing up into an aisle. This is what I see frozen in time. Who knows if it's actually the right memory, but this is what I see. Jeremy with his hands up and slowly backing into an aisle, backing away from Jana and I, until he disappears, until I don't see him any longer. And I thought, what a jerk. Like, I don't know this guy. I'm not needy. Like, I'm not wanting anything from you. This is what I'm thinking in my head. And you're a pastor. You should be kind and caring to people. I was unimpressed. So I tucked it into like the back of my head and thought, I'm probably gonna say something to him if I see him, which I don't see him very often, but if I do, I'm gonna make it a point to be like, hey, that was rude. And so what you know, it was within a couple weeks. I'm coming out of the building, he's coming into the building or something like that. I just remember us standing outside of Blue Ridge, our church, and I stopped him and was like, hey, remember when I saw you at Walmart? You really just jetted, and I thought that was rude. Like, it's not like I want deep and meaningful conversation, but you're a pastor, and I don't think you can just dodge people like that. And as I'm talking, he's just intently listening to me. And he said, Melissa, I could see you were really uncomfortable. That bit of context, because I didn't know Jeremy. And so what context I had from him was up on a stage at a distance, and then my own thoughts. But when he said that one sentence, Melissa, I saw that you were uncomfortable. Have you ever had a moment where it's just like everything rewinds and the whole scene played back in my head again with that context in mind? Melissa, I saw that you were uncomfortable. And as the scene replayed in my head, and I see him like backing down the aisle, literally with his hands up like he's talking to a spooked horse, instantly knowing that was the truth. And I could see it because I got the context that I needed from him. And I was like, oh my goodness, Jeremy, you were being so kind, so caring. Oh, and if you know Jeremy, you know he loves to bring this story up every now and again. It was so enlightening and so eye-opening. I was very incorrect because I did not have the context correct. And what I started to think about when it comes to context is how much knowing someone's head, heart, and hands, you're going to remember this if you've been around, how they think, how they feel, how they act, how much that tells us about who the person is and why they're doing what they're doing. What I know about Jeremy now is he's extremely perceptive, but I did not have that context before, which means I then just filled in the blanks for myself and came up with the wrong conclusion, the wrong understanding. We can do the same thing for the Bible. We can read a sentence, or we can read a paragraph, or we can read a chapter, and we can think, why in the world did he do that? Or did God do that? What is happening here? And what context does is gives us an understanding. It's putting skin on a person that lived 2,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago. I started wondering, what if we looked at context, which is understanding the who, what, when, where, why around the biblical passage? What if we looked at it and brought it just a little lower down and just used a different lens? We're getting the same answers as who, what, where, when, why, but if we made it more relational, if we thought about it more as getting to know Paul, getting to know Peter, getting to know Daniel in the Old Testament, like as real humans with skin on them, with real thoughts, with real feelings, with real lives that they lived out, not how we perceive it, but how they actually lived it. What could that do for our understanding? So here was the test. Bible Lab is in 2 Corinthians, and that's what we're doing context on. And Paul is the one who wrote both 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And since he's the author, I thought it might be interesting for us to look at him, specifically Paul, through the lens of head, heart, hands. If you haven't been around here, you might be like, Melissa, what in the world are you talking about? Super simple. Head, what do I think? These are conclusions, thoughts, theology, doctrine, how I feel relationally to others, to God, to myself. And then hands, obedience, our action. So the assignment to Bible Lab for last week was using the book of 2 Corinthians, find one statement or one verse or one section of scripture that sheds light on how Paul thought or how he felt or what he did, like obedience-wise. They just had to bring one back. For instance, I'll give you mine as an example. Paul lets us know in the book of 2 Corinthians that he could not find Titus. Titus was a beloved friend. Now, can you imagine? There's no cell phones. There's no way to get in touch with someone. If you can't find them, you have no idea what has happened. Is Titus in prison? Has he been arrested? Has he gotten sick and died? where is he and what has happened? And Paul had said, my heart is really troubled. I had no peace of mind. And then we find that Paul leaves for Macedonia, hoping to find Titus there. Well, lo and behold, Titus is there. And Paul talks about being so relieved, this joy. You see this juxtaposition of Paul's heart, which is what I chose, Paul's heart. One of anguish and grief and tears and worry, no peace of mind, having no idea what has happened to Titus, compared to as he sees Titus, can you imagine? Finally, he sees his friend who's alive and well. And he talks about how overjoyed and relieved and grateful to God that he was. Not just that he found Titus, but that Titus actually brought good news to Paul about the church at Corinth. And if you know what's happening in Corinth, they were just an absolute mess, and there's lots of drama going on between Paul and the church at Corinth. But Titus comes back. Not only is he alive, but he's bringing this really good news to Paul about where the Corinthians are at in regards to Paul and their relationship. So we get a sneak peek into Paul's heart. That's context. All of that is context. It gives us deeper understanding into the text that is being written. Before we can apply it to ourselves, we have to understand what's happening there in the minds, the hearts, and the hands of those who lived 2,000 years ago. Now, here's something I thought was extremely interesting. We got into a discussion, maybe a little bit of pushing back and forth, which I love, about Paul, because some of us did not like Paul at all. Just in general, thought maybe he was a little arrogant, a little uppity, and others of us really, really love Paul. So there's a little tension there, right? But it was interesting. We had a board, I'll stick it up here. This is how we do Bible Lab. We put our own thoughts on a Post-it note, and we added our own thoughts to a board so that we can then stand back and collectively look at all of our thoughts together as a whole. Because remember, Bible Lab is about learning with one another. That my thought plus your thought equals a better thought. And then once all of our thoughts are up on the board, we stand back and we make observations. And do you know what was very interesting about this little exercise? As we stepped back to look at Paul in the book of 2 Corinthians, there were so many more Post-it notes on Paul's heart and his hands than there was on his head. Now, the head holds a lot of what some of our friends thought as arrogance, really hard doctrine. Paul was smart. He knew a lot. He was bold. And it was interesting to see and to have somebody in our group say, but wait, are we reading Paul correctly? Because as we stand back and look, it's quite evident how much Paul felt for the church at Corinth. He kept repeating, I love you. I love you. I deeply love you. What his hands were doing was like being poured out like a drink offering for them. There was a lot of obedience with his hands and a lot of emotion toward them. Far more of that happening than actually sterile doctrine being thrown at someone. And I think for some of us, it was surprising. Because in the same way that I misread Jeremy, we can very easily misread authors, writers, people that are in the Bible, not to mention God himself. And so when we slow down and we look at the context, it gives us so much more understanding into their world, into what was happening with them, into what they felt like, what they thought, what they did, and why they did it. I would love to know if this works for you. The next time you go into study, if you pull out one person from that section of scripture and try to find in the actual biblical text, I don't mean we're making it up, I mean in the text that you could support to say, I think this might be what he or she is thinking. I think this might be what he or she is feeling. This is what he or she was doing. And see if that gives you any insight into more of the word that are then around that. Bible Lab is happening face to face. It's just a small group in a friend's living room this semester. We are desperately working. It is taking far longer than I ever thought it would to get it to you. But until then, I am doing little snippets of Bible Lab with our friends on Patreon. They are keeping somewhat of a pace with Bible Lab. So if you're interested in doing this through a screen, and quite frankly, I'm not sure it's going to work through a screen. That's why I'm just testing it with Patreon friends. You can find that link below, or just go to patreon.com and just search Melissa Sue Dunn and I'll pop right up. And there will be a video there that will explain more about Patreon, how it works, what we do, etc., etc. Okay, my friends, I've talked too long, per usual. I hope you'll stick around. I hope you will subscribe and like this video if you found it helpful, or better yet, share it with a friend. If you're curious more about this whole idea of head, heart, hands, you can go to this playlist right here, and that's going to walk you through this whole concept, how we've used it, how it's been helpful, which has really been a game changer. I'll see you next week.